So good morning. We're going to start a new series today, and I'm excited about this. I told the people online just a second ago, I was talking to them, and you didn't know it, that this is a repeat of a series I did 11 years ago, I think it was. We never recorded it, and I wanted to make sure we got it on record because the topics here, I never see anyone do. I've never seen anyone do this, but I think it's probably one of the most important things I've ever done in teaching. So we're going to get it on record, and now I've set your expectations so high, there's no way I can succeed, right? Well, we'll see. This guy kind of capsulizes what we're going to talk about this morning. Hey, Matt, can you slide that over? Is that me? Okay, we're back to is that me? Well, but I feel like that sometimes. So this is what we'll come back to him in a second because that's just a kind of, if you were kind of drowsy, this will put you under. Oh, no, we're all here. Okay. This is the thing we're going to talk about. We're going to talk about Old Testament memes. And memes is a big deal on the internet right now. A meme, usually it's kind of a blue background slide with a cartoon figure on it. And it's usually something kind of snarky, it's a comment on someone's being silly on the internet. But a meme actually, it's an invented word. I don't know, most people don't know this. The actual origin of that, why is this clicking? I don't know. The actual origin of memes is from a guy, let's see, is it on here? No. Okay, let me get to it. Here we go. Here's a meme. This looks like a meme. You keep using that word, I don't think it means what you think it means. And so, what's that? That's from The Princess Bride. I was just going to ask, does anyone know what that quote is from? Princess Bride. Inconceivable! That's what this is from. But what we find is that there's words that we use in the New Testament that come out of the Old Testament. They come from the Old Testament, and they were deliberately used in the New Testament kind of as shorthand speak. So that when you'd hear the word in the New Testament, if you were a Jew and came from the Old Testament, you go, oh. Well, many of us don't have that Old Testament background. So when the word pops up in the New Testament, we look at it and go, well, okay, I think I know what that means. Words like those right there are the words I'm talking about. So we're going to cover all of those words and phrases because although you look at them and you think, I think I know what all those mean, they're actually little cultural snippets from the Old Testament that mean something much more than you understand. So we're going to go back and cover what they mean so that when they drop into the New Testament, you'll read the New Testament verse and go, oh, that's what that means. So that's what a meme is. A meme is a name for a new replicator, a noun that conveys the idea of a unit of cultural transmission. So it's a little chunk of culture that gets carried forward. This is invented by this guy, Richard Dawkins, in his book, Selfish Gene. I'm not a big fan of Richard Dawkins, but he invented the word in that book. It's a little tiny piece of culture. So these words actually represent a little piece of Old Testament culture coming forward into the New Testament, and in that context, even making more sense. Okay? So that's what these are, and we'll take a look at them. Today, we're going to look at the word rest. And when I read the word rest, I think I know what that means, right? You think you know what that means, rest? I know what it's not. I know it's not, running a 5K race. I know it's not being busy taking care of kids. I know it's not. It's all of the things it's not. But what is it? What is it in the positive? So is it this guy? Now let me ask you, look at this guy. Is he at rest?
No.
He's trying to rest, but almost nobody would characterize him as being a rested man, right? And why? Why is he not at rest? It looks like he's sleeping. How can you not be at rest when you're sleeping?
Wait till his coffee cup.
I know. Yeah. Rest is it's a bigger topic. You already know this from English. Rest is a bigger topic than just dozing. There's something else when you say someone is a person who's at rest. It echoes a lot more, right? I mean, you already know this in English. So we're going to go back and look in the Old Testament and see how the word is used, and you'll get an idea of how big this word is and how complete it is. It's not just this guy at breakfast. So let me give you a start. We're going to start in the New Testament, and we're going to see exactly what it says. Here's one that's famous. Dorothy read it this morning. Jesus is speaking, "Come to me all who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest." And when you read that, you go, rest means not working. In fact, this is, when I first read this as a new believer, this is what I was thinking Christianity's all about. Woo! No more work for me. I just got to string my hammock up and get out my book. And Jesus says, you are saved to hang in a hammock and read and sip drinks for the rest of your life. Woo! And of course, we know that's not true. And if you keep reading this verse a little bit more, you'll understand maybe you're mischaracterizing the idea of rest because of what he says next. It clues you in. What does he say next? He says, take my yoke upon you, learn from me, for I'm gentle and lowly of heart, and you'll find rest for your souls. So there's rest there again, but that yoke thing disturbed me when I read it. Because if rest is about hanging in the hammock and reading and sipping drinks, right, in the shade, if that's what rest is, then he introduces this thing of work, this yoke. You know what a yoke is? Let me show you a yoke. That thing on the ox's shoulders, that's a yoke.
Yeah.
So, wait a second. I thought we were talking hammocks and cool drinks. Why are we suddenly talking about being harnessed and pulling a plow? Well, Jesus, you're really confusing me. That's because you don't have an Old Testament understanding what rest is. So rest isn't inactive, okay, which is what I thought from the first verse. Rest is not inactive. There is some activity, but this rest that Jesus is calling us to is an activity that's kind of qualified. For he says, I'm gentle and lowly of heart. That sounds easy. And then lastly, it's easy and the burden is light. So rest, we already know from looking at these verses, we don't have a complete understanding of, and Jesus is qualifying it for us. Rest is not inactivity or sleeping at the breakfast table. Rest is somehow being engaged in a purposeful activity that is not burdensome. Now, you can get that all from this verse right here. You can get that right there. But what is that? What exactly is that? Well, this is where he's actually relying on an Old Testament understanding of the word rest that he uses twice right here. It's not inactive. Let me give you one more New Testament verse before we go to the Old Testament. Hebrews 4:9. Oh, we have got to do Hebrews again. It was so great. We did that 8 or 9 years ago, I think. It was a long time ago. Hebrews. If you've never read Hebrews, read Hebrews. But here's a part that I just love. When the writer of Hebrews is talking about the fact that the Israelites finally did make it into the promised land after a 40-year detour in the desert, it looked like they'd arrived. But what the writer of Hebrews says is, well, yeah, they arrived in the promised land, but they didn't really get to the big arrival. And this is what he talks about, his rest. So then there still remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God. Well, wait, they're in the promised land? But he's saying, yeah, even though they got to the goal that God promised, the promised land, they still have not found the Sabbath rest. Now, it would take us a long time to talk about what that is, but we'll touch on it a bit as we go. There's still something about the fact that even though God's people were in the right place, they weren't fully at rest. Well, what are they missing? I mean, they actually came into a land where they took over regions where they took over like vineyards that they didn't plant, houses that they didn't build. You know, that all of this stuff is there, freebies, and they walked in and they used it. I would think that would put me at rest. But the writer of Hebrews is saying that's not the ultimate capital R rest for the people of God. It's like a picture of it. So we'll talk more about that. He says there still remains a Sabbath rest, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his. So again, we do know that rest seems to have something to do with resting from your works, and we'll qualify that a little bit more. He's already using some Old Testament understanding that he's presuming you know when he says this. So he says, we rest from our works as God rested from his. And before I give you the next verse on here, let me just give you a little detour on this verse. It says that God rested from his works. You remember the creation account in Genesis, right? 6 days, and then he rested. That seventh day never ended. Did you notice that? Everything, all the other 6 days, Sabbath rest. Well, this is the detour, and we don't have time to really follow it too much. But there's so much debate today in modern science about the creation of the universe, and they'll look at people who believe in the Bible and say, you idiots, how can you believe that the universe was created in 6 days? It's a crazy thing. And we say, well, God can do anything. And he can do anything. He can do it in 6 days. He can do it in a microsecond. That's not the issue. The issue you really need to look at in the creation story in Genesis isn't 24-hour days. It's why did God deliberately create the universe in a work week idea? Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Friday, Saturday, and then Sunday. Why is it that he went and did 6 days and then took a rest? God can do anything he wants. He could have created the universe in a snap of a finger, but for some reason he wants to communicate to us that his work was done, like us, in a work week and then a Sabbath day. So when you start talking about how long did it take to create the universe and the 6-day, 24-hour thing, that's kind of a detour discussion. The big discussion is, why did God deliberately do it in this 6-day construct to communicate to us something? He's communicating to us something about the Sabbath. The whole Genesis account is to give us an understanding of the Sabbath, not whether there's 24 hours in a day. Okay?
7 is a very important number.
7's a big number, yeah. So God's trying to, in an artificial teacher way, he's creating the universe to get us to understand something about the Sabbath. That's really important. And again, that'll be a huge theme through the Old Testament. Well, it'll be a part of it today, and we can't really explore it now, but that's just a detour. Let me give you the next verse he writes for us. Let us therefore strive to enter that rest so that no one may fall by the same sort of disobedience. Now, this is way out of context. So you're asking yourself, what kind of disobedience would keep me from resting? What kind? Well, the ones who dropped in the desert and never made it into the promised land. Remember those? I mean, they saw the Red Sea parted. They saw the Egyptian army decimated. They saw all these remarkable miracles. There's food that drops down out of heaven overnight. There's water that comes out of rocks. I mean, they saw incredible stuff. And yet when they got on the verge of going into the promised land, after they sent they sent the spies in, and the spies came back, and 10 out of the 12 of them said, we can't go there because there's giants. They're just going to tear us up. We just can't go there. And you're waiting for someone in the crowd to say, yeah, but what about the Red Sea? And in that discussion, 2 of them do. Caleb and Joshua do say, wait a second, we've got a big God. Well, they never made it into the promised land because they never believed the promise. They never believed that God could make good on his promise. They saw giants, and they figured God can't handle giants. So as the writer of Hebrews writes, they never found their rest in the promised land because they never believed that God could come good on his promise. Now, when you read that whole account, you ask yourself, how can anyone who sees the Red Sea part doubt that God can get you past giants? And you'd say, I never would. But you do too. So there is a reality here he's talking about. So the writer of Hebrews is saying, you can actually miss the opportunity for rest if you don't believe God is good on his promises. And that's the carry away. That's the Cliff Notes version of that section of Hebrews. You can miss rest if you don't believe God's promises to you. How? Well, we'll talk about that. So let's go back and take a look here. But those are ones that clue us in that we need to go to the Old Testament and find out what the Old Testament says about rest. And it's really a very simple task. The word for rest in the Old Testament, rest in English, is this word nuach, that's in the Old Testament in Hebrew. You can take nuach and you can use Bible study software. You can do this as well as me and say, show me everywhere in the Old Testament that nuach shows up as rest. And then you find it gets used a handful of different ways so that the word rest starts to take on a bigger and bigger meaning because it's used in different ways as you go. So that's what we're going to look at this morning and kind of expand our understanding of rest. So we're going to start in Exodus 20. This is leaving Egypt and going to the promised land. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and sea and all that's in them and rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. You've read this before. And again, that's what I'm saying. The creation account is to tell you something about the Sabbath and not what God can get done in 24 hours. That's the big deal here. That basically God worked to put the whole place together. And then the Sabbath comes where you don't have to do that kind of creation work anymore. And it's reserved then for something else. You see at the end of this verse, he says he made it holy. Made it holy. It doesn't mean he made it clean and sinless. That's the wrong idea for holy. Holy is always the idea of set apart. Now, we think of clean and sinless because it's apart from the dirty parts of the world. That's the apartness he's talking about. But holy always means apart. So what he's saying in a literal sense right here is that there were the 6 days to do work, but the 7th one is set apart. It's very different. It's different. And God did that deliberately. God started his 7th day Sabbath apart, and we are to take ours and set it apart too. And in that, somehow, there's rest connected into it. There's rest. He goes on in Exodus 23, and he says, 6 days you shall do your work, but on the 7th day you shall rest. That your ox and your donkey may have rest, and the son of your servant woman and the alien may be refreshed. So clearly what he's talking about in at least these few places and early in the Old Testament, he's talking about just ceasing from work. Whatever it is that occupies you for 6 days, when you get to the 7th day, when there's rest, You stop, you cease from your work. And that's actually the easiest takeaway in the Old Testament. Rest means ceasing from working. So we're going to keep a list here on the right. And it means to cease from working, what you were doing. And he says in the household, everyone should cease from working. Even visitors, even your animals, everyone just take a break. Just relax. Because that seventh day is set apart from the other six. The other six, go ahead and work. Work's a good thing. But on the seventh, we do something different. We set it apart, different. We'll talk about that. Okay, let's take another look. If you follow Noach, if you go back to Deuteronomy 12, but when you go over the Jordan, this is crossing the Jordan River to go to the promised land, and you live in the land that the Lord your God is giving you to inherit, and when he gives you rest from all of your enemies around so that you'll live in safety. So here, you go in and you plant yourself in the place, but he's giving you rest from your enemies. And remember when they came into the promised land, there were people who lived there, there were nasty people, there were enemies that followed. He says, when you get to the point where all of that fighting is done, when God gives you rest from all that fighting, in a sense, security, then you can plant yourselves in your homes and you can live your lives. He does it in another place, Joshua 21. And this is after they've made it into the promised land. And the Lord God gave them rest on every side, just as he had sworn to their fathers. Not one of all their enemies had withstood them, for the Lord had given all their enemies into their hands. So again, rest here, nuach again, means to kind of be secure. You can rest from having to fight the things that threaten you, okay? So it's not necessarily ceasing from work. It's ceasing from dealing with the threats in your life, okay? And that's what it is. I'll give you one more here. I think actually I've got two more. 2 Chronicles 15. And all Judah rejoiced over the oath, for they had sworn with all their heart and had sought him with their whole desire. That's God. And he was found by them, and the Lord gave them rest all around. So the all around part means the periphery of your defensive line. So all around where they would look where the bad guys are, God gave them rest from those threats. That's what he's talking. Now I think I got one more. Yeah, I got one more. 2 Samuel 7. This is during the life of David, late. And so now when the king, David, lived in his house and the Lord had given him rest from all his surrounding enemies, see, there it is. The king said to Nathan the prophet, see now, I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent. And then right after this, David makes his push to build a permanent, limestone building for God's ark to be in, the temple. But see what he says right here? It got to the point where when David as king has fought and fought and fought and fought, and then God finally gave him security on his boundaries. See that? He says he's given him rest from all the surrounding enemies. Then you can go on with the rest parts of life. So again, it's used in a way of talking about security from the threats that are there. And so we'll add that to our list. Not only is it ceasing working, but rest is also used in terms of the fact that God successfully secures your position from harm. Security from that. The defenses you no longer have to put your effort and your mind share into, because he's given you rest from the threats in your life. So store that, because that's a really important point that's used a lot. This word is used a lot about being secure from enemies, from threats. Let's try another way it's used. Genesis 8:4. We go back to Genesis 8. And in the 7th month, on the 17th day of the month, the ark came to rest on the mountains of Ararat. What, did the ark stop working? No. Was the ark now out of threat and secure? No. So in this way, nuach is used in terms of something finally settling down, and it rests, kind of upon something. It's like a relative position of things. Exodus 10. He says, the locust came up over the land of Egypt and settled, that's actually the same word, nuach, on the whole country of Egypt, such a dense swarm of locusts that had never been before nor ever will be again. Grasshoppers eating everything you do. So settled. So again, it's the idea, the ark, Noah's ark settled, it rested. And in this case, the grasshoppers came and they rested all over your crops. So again, it's the idea, resting is about not kind of being around here, but actually going, and settling upon something. That's rest as well. It's used a lot in the Old Testament. Let me give you another one. Numbers 11. As soon as the Spirit rested on them, they prophesied. Again, the Spirit didn't cease working, nor did it find itself free from its enemies. The Spirit settled upon, and that's rest. That's resting. So it's actually the idea when you rest and you go to bed, you actually settle upon your bed. That whole idea about crashing on your bed, that's rest as well in the Old Testament. All right, so it's being down on something like that. I think I've got one more. Proverbs 14:33. Wisdom rests in the heart of a man of understanding, but it makes itself known even in the midst of fools. I love that verse for a whole lot of other reasons, but wisdom rests on the heart. Again, it's settled upon and resident in. So again, the idea of rest here is not ceasing from working or necessarily free from enemies. It's about settled and stays. There's an idea about staying right there. Okay, so that's an important component of rest in the Old Testament as well. It's used a lot. So you cease from your work, you're secure from the threats to you, and you also find yourself kind of settled upon something. That's what rest is, when you settle upon something. It's also, by contrast, instead of you sort of flitting around and doing a lot of stuff up here where you're moving around and you never really settled in life, you know, and if you grow up in your house and you go to a school, then you're out on your own, and then your parents come to you some Christmas and say, when are you going to rest on something in life? When are you going to finally settle down? When are you going to settle down? Well, that's what this word is. It's basically to settle upon something and rest there. Very common in the Old Testament. And let me give you one more example, how it's used. Joshua 1:13, just the beginning as they go into the promised land. Remember the word that Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded you, saying, the Lord your God is providing you a place of rest and will give you this land. So rest also takes on the idea of the place that rest happens. You could look at the promised land, as Joshua is saying, and you're going into this promised land, but that's a place where you're going to find rest. In a sense, that place is rest because of the place. Okay, so that whole idea of the place of rest is a big, big, big one. I'll give you one more. Joshua 22. So after the end of going into the promised land, he says, and now the Lord your God has given rest to your brothers as he promised them. Therefore turn and go to your tents in the land where your possession lies, which Moses, the servant of the Lord, gave you on the other side of the Jordan. So again, the whole idea is here we are finally in the promised land, and the place is itself rest. Which is why it's interesting when the writer in the New Testament of Hebrews says, he says, even though they did make it into the promised land, there still remained a Sabbath rest for the people of God. So they're thinking, well, wait, we have our rest because we're in the promised land. And the writer of Hebrews says, well, that's kind of rest, but there's a bigger rest even still. That's just a picture of the big rest that's to come. Okay? And if you want to short circuit the discussion a little bit, that big rest is the rest of being in God's kingdom and having him take care of you. And so the kingdom of God in just Israel and the place and the promise of rest was really a picture of the larger sense that even beyond that, there's a bigger rest to come. That's what the writer of Hebrews 4 is saying. Well, let's capsulize some of this for a little bit. So you cease from your work. You're secure from the things that threaten you. You're settled upon something. You're no longer floating around and restless in that sense. And then lastly, you actually find home. Rest is a synonym for home in the Old Testament. It's a place to go. Now, this time of year, everyone travels a lot. And you visit relatives, or you visit friends or stuff like that. And when you go, you just can't wait to go. Wow, here we go. And you're on the road and you're visiting people and you're visiting the friends. And you do that for a couple of days. Isn't this great? You get to the end of the week and you think, oh, this is wonderful. Let's do another week. And then you go into the second week and you're going, this is great. And then you get to the end of the second week, you're saying, I got to go home and rest. Right? It's not a cessation of driving. It's a place of saying, when I get home, we always say when we get home from something like that, the first night we get in our bed, we go, my bed. That's how rest is used. Exactly like that. It is, we're home and I have my bed. It's a home. It's a place where you can let your hair down and you don't have to have concerns about threats. I mean, you can just... Now, I started off this series with rest because for me, this is probably the most important meme of the entire Old Testament. I kid you not. When someone says about being saved, isn't that an important cultural meme? Isn't that an important message? It is. I'm saved from judgment. I'm saved from the wrath of God because of my sins, which I deserve. But what am I saved to? Well, I'm saved to life with God that's characterized by the capital R, rest. That's the promise through the entire Old Testament. And that's the promise when you get in the New Testament. So when Jesus says, come to me, all you who are heavy burden laden, I will give you rest. It's the promise of the entire Old Testament. And it's a promise that is pictured in the midst of God. This is relationship with God. What is life like to you in relationship with God? Rest. Hey, let's pull it apart a little bit more because it's all of these ideas right here. See if I can make this work. So let me ask you, are you at rest? Well, with the first idea, you can ask yourself, do I trust in my own works all the time? Because if you're trusting in your own works all the time, you may not be at rest. Now, how can you see this in real life? You see this in real life when you seem to be terrorized by the work schedule that you're under. Or say, I've got to do this. If I don't do this, it'll be bad. I've got to, I ought, I need to do this. If the work itself is something you put your trust in, and that if you don't accomplish the work, you fail yourself. If your trust, now I'm using that word specifically, if your trust is in your work and what you achieve, then you're not at rest, technically speaking. Now, a lot of people will say, well, wait a second. 6 days, you said I could work, and there's nothing wrong with that. It's the seventh day I've got to protect, right? Well, yeah, technically speaking, that's true. But there is something about someone who's not at rest that even on the seventh day, even though they force themselves not to work, they're still thinking about work. That person's not at rest. Person's not at rest. And it comes down to a trust issue. Where do you place your trust? Do you place your trust in your works, in your own works? Now, and I'm talking about that just in terms of providing life now. But in the worst case, it's about providing life in the hereafter. If I don't work enough now, I don't have life in the hereafter either. And that's salvation by works, and that's horribly twisted wrong. But there's a whole culture of religious people who don't know what God's intention is for mankind, who think that if they fail in what they do tomorrow, they may not earn what they need in the end. And that's a terror. That's an absolute terror to people. And so when you propose to the people like that, well, you need to take some time off. You don't really need to do that. I mean, come on, cut yourself some slack. No, you don't understand. I need to do this because I need to do all that I can do. That's the line that's used. I need to do all that I can do. Well, will you know when you achieve enough? No. All I know is if there's more I can do, I need to do more. So if you suggest to someone in that mindset that you need to kind of back off a notch, no, because that does not line up with all that you can do. I can still do more. That is the worst kind of bondage I could ever conceive. I mean, ever conceive. It's inconceivable. No, it's not. I can conceive of it. It's really, really bad. And you have neighbors and friends who don't know the Lord, don't know the truth from the Word, and they're absolutely ruled and terrorized by this need to accomplish. They're trusting in themselves. They're trusting in their own work. That applies not only to the hereafter, but even right now. It applies even right now. So that's a big one. If you are trusting in your own works, and you can tell, because if you take a break from your works, how does it make you feel? If you're trusting your own works, then in a real sense, you have not ceased from your labors. I don't care whether it's the 6 days or the 7, you have not ceased. Now, to give you a flip side to this, Israel would not rest. They needed to work because they didn't trust that when they were inactive for that seventh day that God would come through. And let me ramp up the contrast on this because we all know about the 6 days of work and the seventh day of rest, right? But did you know that God said to Israel, we're going to do this on a year basis now? You're going to work, you're going to do your stuff for 6 years. And on the seventh year, you're not going to do any work. You're not going to plow. You're not going to plant. You're not going to do anything. Now, as a farmer, as an agrarian culture, you look at that and go, well, that's a recipe for death. I mean, what do you mean I don't plant? We're all going to die. Of course you have to do this. I'm having a hard enough time, they would say, not going out and checking my crops on the seventh day. Because if I don't go out there and pick the grasshoppers off, it's not only me that's going to starve, it's my kids and my wife that are going to starve. That's irresponsible. So I need to go out there and do all that I can do to ensure the welfare of my family. So, I mean, that's a rational concern. There's nothing irrational about that, except that when God says, take a day off, he also has with that, I got you covered. So now you have to actually trust that God does have you covered. Again, when they didn't make it in the promised lands, the ones who said, I don't think God has us covered anymore. I think the giants are going to get the better of God, so we're not going to win. I don't believe God can do this. So really, the inability to cease from your works and to rest from your works, your inability to do that comes in complete correspondence to how much you trust or don't trust God to cover you while you're not doing it. It's a trust issue in God. That's exactly why God set up this system with Israel. He wanted them to learn that God is trustable and that he'll come through and provide for you, and that man does not live by bread alone, what you do, but by what? The words that come from his mouth, his promise to provide for you. So that's the trusting exercise he did with Israel. That's what he does with us. That's why the Sabbath day is there, just to teach us God is dependable. And those of us who've known the Lord and have come to know Jesus and all that, we start to look at this and say, you know what? I think rest is not a seventh day issue. I think it's an everyday issue. Yes. Because if I trust God on the seventh day when I deliberately don't work, I can also trust him on the days I do work. Instead of trusting my works, I can trust God's works 24/7. And so the life of a believer who understands God is the life of someone who says, sure, I work. I like to work. It's delightful to work. But you know what? God's got my back the 6 days and the seventh day, all the time. Now, you can work awfully hard during the 6. You can work your way up. Did that change? No. You can work your way up like in the structure of wherever you work. You can get promotions. You can get advancements. You can get more money and stuff like that. You put your trust in how well you accomplish what you do there. And then someday you can come in and they can say, it's not your fault, but you're fired. We're closing the company. And then all the trust you put in your ability to do well at work completely evaporates. And so you say to God, God, what happened? I did everything I could think of. They should not have fired me. God, I need you. And God says, yeah, you needed me all along. Because the ability of your success at work did not guarantee anything there. I'll tell you what guarantees life for you. It's not your job. It's me. So a believer understands that trust in God allows you to rest, allows you to take a break and kick back and say, I'm going to rest because God's got this. Even in the midst of my busiest time, it's not inactivity. In the midst of my busiest time, you need to say, the outcome of life after me doing this has a little but almost nothing to do with how well I accomplish the next thing I'm doing. It has everything to do with me going to God and say, God, from you and you alone, I get life. Not from working. Now, I got to tell you, before we move on from this, this is probably the toughest hurdle for people who don't understand biblical truth to get over. It's just a really difficult, you live your entire life depending on you and trusting in you, and then you come where God says in the Bible, old and new, I want to provide for you fully. And I want you to rest sometimes. You go, well, don't I have to, what? And Jesus understood this too. It was so much a part of the first century twisted Judaism that he came into that, he said to them in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, people are just busting their butts to get stuff done to provide clothing and sandals and food on the table. All that. People working so hard. And Jesus says in the Sermon on the Mount, you remember this? He says, stop. Just stop this stuff, Look at the birds. They're not all stressed out about stuff, but your Father feeds them, Seek first his kingdom and his righteousness, and all of that will be added to you. You don't have to put your concern and let that terrorize you, because God's got you on Monday through Sunday. He must provide. So it's a tough one. Let me just do the other. Are you resting if you do this? Do you worry about threats? Oh, no. Yes, I do. I worry about threats. Now, I say this because, remember, he says he gave them rest all around. He rests from their enemies. Someone who's at rest does not constantly think about the threats in their life because God has finished that on your behalf. That's a rested person. A person who rests no longer sits there and imagines the worst that can happen to you, right? Now we all have threats in our lives, threats of losing jobs or threats of death or health, or lots of threats, or people that just don't like you, We all have those kinds of threats. And those threats translate in our mind to, I can think about how this could be bad for me. We all have brains enough to understand how it can be bad for you. And so as a result, as you lay on your pillow, you imagine the worst, right? A person who's rested in God says, God's got my back in every direction. I do not have to lay awake at night and worry about the threats. And so when a real threat does come, and real threats do come, they came in the Old Testament and the New. When real threats come, what do? You say, God, you've got my, you guard my rear and you guard my front and you guard my sides. You said you've always done this. There's nothing can separate me from your love, right? You tell yourself who God is and what he's like and the fact that he has given you rest from your enemies. And he has. He's given you rest from your enemies. And so when an enemy tries to poke itself inside that bubble, you lay down at night and say, God, I'm tempted to really worry about this, but you love me and your power is immense and your understanding of the situation is perfect. So I'm going to rest because you've given me rest all around. And worry. You don't have to. You can either pray about that, remind yourself who God is, or you can worry about it and take it on yourself. Again, it's a trust issue. Do you see this? It's a trust issue. Are you trusting yourself to push back the assaults? Or are you trusting God to secure your perimeter? It's a whole different kind of thing. That's rest in a really big thing. You will not be rested unless you stop worrying about threats. How about this upon stuff? And I'm going to expand this a little bit. Do you drift? Are you tossed around? Are you not rested somewhere upon something yet? Really, the whole idea of this rest upon is the idea that you're not being messed around anymore. You've actually found a place, a resting place, and not in a man-made creed. We sang that this morning. I'm settled right here. And where do you settle? You settle in the midst of God himself. You're no longer being tossed about. That's another really big concept about rest. Rest, someone who's rested is not someone who's constantly going about searching around for what's going to make their life better. Or someone who's saying, I need to go out and find myself, and then I'll be rested. No, if you find yourself, you'll just be depressed. You need something outside of yourself, and that someone outside of yourself is God himself. And so when we find the Lord, or he finds us is a better way to put it, when we find him, we stop all that drifting around and we say, I've rested upon him. I'm no longer going to be drifting around. So if you're tempted to look around and say, I think what I need to do is a little bit of modern Buddhism. That might finally bring me a little bit of happiness. So I'm going to drift over there for a while, and I'm going to settle for a bit. Oh, maybe that's not it. Maybe I got to do something else over here that's new agey. Oh, that wasn't it. People who are not rested tend to drift around looking for what's going to do it for them, right? This idea of rest in the Old Testament is, to use a poorly used phrase here, you say this is the place. And you rest in him. You rest in him. I've decided to settle here. That's someone who's rested. Finally, are you rested? Do you seek another home all the time? And this is really this where you're going to when you're actually doing this drifting. You're trying to look for a place that'll be more home, more fit for who you are. But again, once you finally go over there and you settle and you realize, well, this is a bad fit. This is not home. So someone who understands who the Lord is and what he's providing for you can actually settle upon, and you can say, you know what? This is home for me now. Nothing else will ever be home for me anymore. I don't have to go flitting after Buddhism. I don't have to go flitting after materialism. I don't have to go flitting after all these other things that call to me that say, if you pursue me, you'll find a home in that. And people who pursue those things don't really find homes. When you're in the Lord, you have a home. In him. A home like, gee, I'm glad to be home. Hey, it's my bed. That kind of home idea. We have it in the Lord. That's part of the promised rest. So when Jesus says, I'll give you rest, he's saying with that one, I'll give you a place you can lay down and say, this fits. This is what I was always made for. This is home like no other place ever will be. I'm at home in him. Well, let's kind of wrap this up. So when Jesus says in Matthew 11:28, come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I'll give you rest. And interestingly enough, it's not rest for our muscles. It's rest for our souls. We're talking about big stuff here. We're talking about ceasing from labor, ceasing from trusting in the results of your own work to provide life for you, that kind of a thing. Also, we're looking not only for that, but we're looking for some kind of protection from the things that are out to get us. Jesus, I'll give you that too. I'll give you that too. I'll protect you, and you can live in me in that sense. You can stop wandering and drifting around. Jesus says, I'll give you rest. And you can settle in him. You can stop looking. I'm the answer you've always looked for. And then once you finally find me, and you find life in me, and you settle in me, you'll find home. Now see, that is also what God promised the Israelites with the promised land. All those things. Those are all concepts of that, right? God says, I promise you this place. There you'll be able to take a day off a week. You'll be able to take a year off every 7 years. Whoa! You know? And I'll provide for your crops. I'll bring the rain for you and the dew, so you don't have to stress out at night about how your crops are doing. Sure, you'll work some, but you don't have to be ruled by the fear that your work will fail you and you'll die. I will provide for you. You can cease from that kind of working mindset. I do want you to be active. Jesus says there's still a yoke. But you got to understand, it's not on your backs anymore. It's on my back. I'll take care of you. So he gave them a place where they could cease from that kind of domination of concern for a work outcome. I'll take you to a place where I will draw a line around the borders of Israel, and the bad guys will not come in. Now, there were times when the bad guys did come in. And why? Because they stopped trusting that God could do this. And so he said, okay, hands are off. Good luck with that. You'll love the Babylonians. They're great people. No, that's not the way it works. But while they were trusting him and following him and said, God, you need to be the one who protects our borders, God said, amen. That's what I'm here for. That's why I have a specific place. And in this specific place, you no longer have to wander in the desert, drifting around, trying to find a place for home. I've given you this place. Settle here. Settle upon this place. And when you get there, you'll be home. Now that's a picture of our life with God even bigger. And even for the Israelites, even bigger. This is a place that's okay. You can find home here. But you know what? This place is not my home. Really. I can find some home in God here, but there's a place coming later that's really the bigger home. You know, when we come and see him in the end, in the afterlife, we'll lay down on the bed there and go, you know, this is always my home. And I sampled this while I was alive here. I understood what home was like when I was in the midst of where God was. And he says, but there's a bigger home. Even to the Israelites, the writers of Hebrews 4. Okay, so they got in the land, but there still exists a Sabbath rest. A real like, so God made man to have fellowship with God, and in that process to provide him a home in the midst of God. So God can say to you, this is where you've always belonged. And those of us who spent a lifetime before coming to God trying everything else and flitting around will finally say, you know what, I did try a lot of stuff. I tried drugs. I tried money. I tried sex. I tried rock and roll. I tried everything I thought looked like it promised wonderful stuff. But none of those places were home until I found you and I found home. And that's God's intention throughout the entire Old Testament and the entire New Testament. Saved from the wrath of God, yes, but saved to rest in him. Rest, capital R, with all the ideas of the Old Testament of rest. Not just stopping from working. So here's the summary. Here's my lady meme who will come up several times. So you can relax. Come on, you can relax. That's really what we're talking about. 6 days or 7. God loves you and wants to provide for you. He wants to protect you. He wants to settle you. He wants to give you a home. And this is the gospel message in a nutshell. God loves you and he wants to give you a home in him. The problem is, like the writer of Hebrews 4 says, you can miss that by saying, I don't believe that's true about God. I don't believe that's true about God. God may make promises, but he's making promises that don't really come true. And if you stiff-arm God on this, God as a gentleman will say, well, I'll never force it down your throat. So I'll just step aside and have at your other stuff. But in the end, those of us who found the Lord have found this. God loves you. He wants to provide for you. He wants to protect you. He wants to settle you from this endless search. He wants to give you a home in him. In him. So now let me ask you as we kind of finish this up. I think that's my last. Oh, I'm going to give you one example first. So if you failed those 4 questions about rest, think about it. Do you trust your work too much for yourself? I mean, all those other things. You really need to reach pretty far in and say, am I really at rest about this and about this? Am I really trusting God? Because the degree to which you trust God for the outcome of life, you'll find rest. You really will. And he wants to provide that for you. If you don't, then you're going to stiff arm him And he's going to back out of those. So just watch. I wanted to give you one example before we quit. These guys, you know these guys? You know Martin Luther? Yeah. Well, not face to face. I mean, not like he'd recognize you if you met him someplace. Martin Luther, who was at the vanguard of the Protestant Reformation, 16th century, stuff like that, did some really nervy things where he wrote on a piece of paper 95 problems that he had with the Catholic Church and pinned them on the door of a church, saying, I got problems with this. That was Martin Luther. But after Martin Luther started his objections to the Catholic Church, this other guy, Philip Melanchthon, came along and it was kind of his right-hand man, his helper. Most people attribute some of the smartest stuff of the Reformation to Melanchthon rather than to Luther, really, because Melanchthon was really a very smart guy. Well, once this revolution of Reformation started, Luther and Melanchthon started working really hard to try and put on paper, so what's the biblical view of how Christian life is supposed to be? Not the Catholic view and not the Pope view, but what's the biblical view of what it is? So these guys worked day after day after day after day trying to put together, and it was Melanchthon who came up with one of the first what we call systematic theologies. Like you could get one book and find out what's the summary of everything that says in the Bible in kind of a topical form. That was Melanchthon who did that. So these guys worked tirelessly after the Reformation started to try and communicate what's in the Bible, because very few people could read the Bible because no one could read Greek and Hebrew. It wasn't in German like where these guys lived until this happened. Well, so they worked, and they're famous for what they put out during this period to try and capture what God's saying in the Bible about what life with him is like. So here's a very famous interchange that happened. It's one of my best illustrations of rest. So Philip Melanchthon one day says, Martin, this day we shall discuss the governance of the universe. This guy was gung-ho. And you know what Luther's response was? This day you and I shall go fishing and leave governance of the universe to God. Now that's a man at rest right there. That's a man at rest. You can take some time off because God's got you. You're okay. Everything's fine. Today we're going to go fishing. Okay? We're going to sing this last song because it has it on there. Whose arms do you lean on? Look at the verse first. Whose arms do you lean on? Are you safe and secure from all alarms? Remember that defensive posture? Are you safe and secure from all alarms? I mean, really? Really? Are you rested in that? We lean on his everlasting arms. The degree to which in your life right now you trust and lean on his arms. Arms is a euphemism for strength. You lean on his arms, then you'll find rest. I kid you not. You will find rest. But the degree to which you say, well, I don't know, my arm's pretty big. That's pitiful, isn't it? Yeah. My arm's pretty big. I can provide for myself because after all, if I don't provide for myself, who will? Well, God will if you'll trust him. So we need to lean on his everlasting arms. That's rest. The biggest, most powerful, great promise of the Old Testament you'll ever run up against, that's moved in the New Testament where Jesus says, I'm here to give you rest. Okay. Father in heaven, we thank you so much for these words. We are so encouraged that you are not a God who's distant, who doesn't care about what we go through. You're a God who promises and calls us to rest in you. And that takes active trust in you, and that takes active understanding of who you are, and that takes active understanding of what your promises are to us. But Lord, the little we know about you, and the little we know about your promises, we are persuaded that everything else that we try and pursue will never come up to the measure of what you have always promised to us, which is rest in you. You made us for that. You made us for that. So Lord, as we go away from here, most of us aren't really too self-aware about where we may not be resting, really, and where we may not be fully trusting in you. So I pray that your Spirit would take these ideas and these passages and challenge us and say, you know, there is more rest in promise to you if you would just trust me with this part. So Lord, challenge us through your Spirit, draw us near to you, and delight us with what you've promised to us in the beginning of the universe, a Sabbath day of rest in you. So thank you for this great hope that you give us in this one single little word. And we thank you that Jesus picked it up in the New Testament and said, that's what I'm all about too. And we've come to understand that. So thank you for these wonderful passages in Jesus' name. Amen.